I never expected to notice her that way, my best friend's mom. But the night her fingers brushed through my hair, and she smiled at me with that quiet warmth in her eyes, everything I thought I knew about us began to change. I still remember the first time I really noticed her, not just as my friend's mom, but as someone entirely her own. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind where time seems to drift instead of move. I had come over to hang out with my friend, like I'd done countless times before. The house was familiar, the scuffed hardwood floor, the faint scent of cinnamon that seemed to cling to the air, the way sunlight pooled across the living room rug. But what I hadn't expected was to catch myself watching her with a different kind of awareness. She was in the kitchen when I walked in, moving with this calm, unhurried grace, her hands steady as she rinsed vegetables at the sink. There was nothing dramatic about it, nothing that screamed for attention. Yet I couldn't help but notice the way her hair fell loosely against her shoulders, how she tucked a strand back with the simplest motion, as if unaware of how elegant it looked. When she turned toward me, her eyes caught mine for just a second longer than they should have. It was a glance layered with warmth, the kind that says you're welcome here, you're part of this home. And yet, in that fleeting pause, I felt something stir, a quiet, unspoken pull. I told myself not to linger on it, not to cross that invisible line in my thoughts. She was my friend's mom, after all. But even in that moment, some part of me knew this wasn't the last time I'd feel it. She greeted me with a smile, gentle, practiced, but never hollow. "You always come hungry, don't you?" she teased lightly, her voice carrying that low, steady tone that seemed to smooth out the edges of the room. My friend laughed from down the hall, calling back something sarcastic, but I barely heard him. I was too caught up in how her words seemed aimed at me alone, how the corners of her lips lifted in a way that made the joke feel personal. Later, as I set my bag down and joined my friend in the living room, she passed by us. The brush of her cardigan sleeve grazed against my arm, a fleeting touch, so light it could have gone unnoticed. But I noticed. The softness lingered longer in my mind than it should have. And when she reached up to adjust the vase of flowers on the shelf, I caught myself stealing another glance at her, how effortless her movements were, how she seemed to carry both strength and gentleness in the same breath. I tried to shake it off, to fold the feeling away as nothing more than a passing thought. But something had shifted. I couldn't define it, and I certainly couldn't admit it, not to my friend, not to myself. Still, the truth was there, buried beneath the ordinary sounds of that house. For the first time, I saw her not as someone's mother, but as a woman who held a kind of quiet beauty I couldn't ignore. And no matter how hard I tried, I knew I'd never see her the same way again. It was later that same day when the first real conversation happened, the kind that lingers in your mind long after it's over. My friend had disappeared upstairs, rummaging for something he'd forgotten in his room, leaving me alone in the living room. I didn't think much of it at first. I just sat there, scrolling absently through my phone, listening to the faint creak of footsteps overhead. Then, her voice drifted in from the kitchen. "You want some tea?" she called, casual, as though it was second nature to offer. I hesitated a moment before answering. "Sure, thank you." She appeared a few minutes later, carrying 2 mugs. The steam curled gently upward, catching the light from the window. She handed one to me, her fingers brushing against mine, barely a second, but enough for the warmth of her hand to register even before the heat of the ceramic cup did. "Chamomile," she said with a small smile. "You look like you could use something calming." That made me laugh under my breath. Do I really seem that stressed? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she settled into the armchair across from me, tucking her legs slightly under herself. There was something disarming about the way she sat, not formal, not guarded, just comfortable in her own home. Her eyes lingered on me with the kind of attention most people rarely gave. "Not stressed," she said at last. "Just, restless. Like you've got a lot on your mind." Her words caught me off guard. I wasn't used to anyone noticing that much about me. My friends didn't. Even my own family usually took my silences at face value. But she was watching me closely, as if she could see the edges of things I hadn't said. So I found myself opening up in ways I normally didn't. I told her about school, how everything felt like it was moving too fast, like I was supposed to have my whole life figured out but couldn't even decide what I wanted next week to look like. She didn't interrupt, didn't laugh, didn't dismiss it as youthful complaining. She just listened. And when she did respond, it wasn't advice disguised as a lecture, it was thoughtful, measured. "I know it feels that way now," she said softly, fingers curled around her mug. "But you have time. More than you think. Life doesn't need to be solved in one sitting." The warmth of her words settled into me almost as much as the tea did. I found myself studying the way her hair fell forward when she tilted her head, the small lines at the corners of her eyes that only deepened when she smiled. They weren't flaws, they were stories, and for some reason I wanted to know them all. Just then, my friend bounded back into the room, breaking the quiet. He teased me for stealing his mom's attention, though he meant it as a joke. We both laughed along, but as our eyes met briefly over the rim of her cup, I knew the moment had meant more than that. For the first time, I felt the faint beginning of a connection, something private, unspoken, quietly building between us. The day stretched on in that easy, familiar way it always did when I spent time there. But at some point, as the afternoon sun began to soften into a warmer glow, I felt the weight of tiredness press down on me. Maybe it was from the week I'd had, maybe it was just the comfort of that house, but I sank deeper into the couch cushions, letting my head tilt back against the armrest. I thought I was alone in the room. My friend had slipped outside to take a call, and I assumed his mom had gone with him. But then I heard the faint sound of footsteps, softer this time, almost hesitant. When I opened my eyes, she was there, standing just a few feet away, watching me with a kind of gentle concern. "You look exhausted," she said, her voice quiet, almost more to herself than to me. I smiled faintly, trying to shrug it off. "Yeah, long week, I guess." There was a pause. She crossed the room slowly, and instead of taking the armchair like before, she lowered herself onto the couch beside me. The shift of the cushion was subtle, but I felt it instantly, the nearness of her presence, the faint warmth radiating between us. I closed my eyes again, not out of tiredness this time, but because I didn't quite know where to look. And then, unexpectedly, I felt it, her fingers brushing lightly through my hair. It was such a simple gesture, yet it sent a quiet shock through me. Her touch was gentle, deliberate, the pads of her fingers trailing softly along my scalp as if she were smoothing away the weight I carried. I held my breath without meaning to, every nerve alert to that fleeting contact. For a moment, I almost forgot to breathe. No one had touched me like that in a long time, not playfully, not out of obligation, but with real care. It felt intimate, in a way that words couldn't explain. She seemed to realize it too. Her hand lingered just a second too long before she pulled it back, almost as though she had caught herself in a moment she hadn't intended to cross into. When I turned my head to look at her, she was already withdrawing, her expression a mixture of tenderness and restraint. "Sorry," she murmured, her smile soft but slightly nervous. I used to do that when my son was younger. Old habits." I nodded, but there was no mistaking what had passed between us. It hadn't felt like a motherly gesture, not really. Not with the way my chest tightened at her touch, or the way her eyes lingered on mine just a second longer than necessary. "Don't be sorry," I said quietly, and the words hung there between us, more loaded than I'd meant them to be. She gave a small smile then, one that carried both warmth and caution, before leaning back slightly, putting a little more space between us. But even with that space, the air still carried the electricity of that moment. My friend's footsteps returned a minute later, breaking the silence, and she rose quickly to her feet, smoothing the front of her sweater as though nothing had happened. But for me, everything had changed. Because for the first time, I knew that she had felt it too. Dinner that evening was simple: roast chicken, vegetables, bread warmed in the oven, but the act of preparing it stretched into something far more meaningful than the food itself. My friend had vanished into the basement, looking for a game console cable, leaving just the two of us in the kitchen. At first, I thought I should keep my distance, not wanting to intrude on her space. But she looked over her shoulder, gave me a smile, and said, "If you're going to wait around, you might as well make yourself useful." I laughed, stepping closer to the counter. "What do you need me to do?" She handed me a cutting board and a knife, her fingers brushing against mine in the transfer. It was innocent, practical, even, but it still made my chest tighten in that now familiar way. The rhythm of working side by side came easily. She rinsed the vegetables, passing them to me one by one, and I chopped while she seasoned the chicken. Our movements began to sync, almost like a dance, unspoken yet seamless. Each time she reached across me for something, her sleeve would brush my arm. Each time I handed her a bowl, my fingers seemed to graze hers. Neither of us pulled away quickly anymore. At one point, she leaned in to grab a spice jar from the shelf above me, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume, warm, floral, delicate. For a second, she was so close that a strand of her hair slipped across my shoulder. I froze, not daring to move, savoring the quiet intimacy of that simple contact. She must have felt it too, because when she stepped back, there was a faint color in her cheeks. She busied herself with the oven, but I noticed how her hand lingered on the edge of the counter for just a second longer than necessary, as if grounding herself. We didn't speak much, but the silence between us wasn't empty. It was charged, filled with everything we weren't saying. Every glance carried a weight. Every smile seemed to stretch just a little too long. When the food was finally in the oven, we both leaned against the counter, side by side. Our shoulders brushed lightly, so lightly that either of us could have stepped away. But neither of us did. Instead, we stayed there, shoulder to shoulder, breathing in the quiet warmth of the moment. "You're good at this," she said softly, nodding toward the cutting board. I chuckled. Guess I had a good teacher. She turned her head, eyes meeting mine. For a second, it felt like the whole world narrowed down to that single look, the kind that said more than words ever could. There was something in her gaze, tender yet conflicted, that mirrored exactly what I was feeling. The oven timer broke the spell, beeping loudly, and she moved away with a small laugh, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. But the silence that followed wasn't the same as before. Because now, we both knew. We both felt it. And we both chose, without a single word, not to let it go. The evening wound down slowly, the house quieting as night settled in. Dinner had been warm, comfortable, filled with easy conversation and laughter, but now the energy had shifted. My friend had excused himself to his room, headphones already in, lost in some online game. That left just the two of us in the living room, the soft glow of a lamp filling the space with a golden hush. She carried in 2 cups of tea, setting one gently on the table in front of me before curling into the other end of the couch. The distance between us was polite, but it felt like the whole air of the room was drawn tight between where she sat and where I was. For a while, we didn't say much. The sound of rain had begun outside, pattering lightly against the windows, filling the silence with a kind of steady rhythm. I sipped my tea, trying not to think too much about the way the lamplight softened her features, or how natural it felt to be sitting here with her, like it was exactly where I was supposed to be. Then she spoke, her voice low. "Do you ever feel like life is moving too quickly?" I turned my head toward her. The way she asked it wasn't casual, it carried weight, like the thought had been sitting with her for a while. "Yeah," I said honestly. "All the time." She let out a quiet laugh, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Sometimes I look at my son and realize how fast he's grown. One day he's asking me to tie his shoes, the next he's taller than me and barely needs me for anything." Her eyes drifted down to her mug. "And I wonder, what's left for me now? Who am I, besides being someone's mother?" There was a vulnerability in her voice I hadn't heard before. It was steady, but edged with something softer, an honesty she wasn't used to sharing. I set my cup down and leaned forward slightly. You're more than that. Way more. She looked up, meeting my eyes. For a second, she seemed unsure whether to believe me. So I continued, my voice steadier than I felt. You're thoughtful. You notice things about people most wouldn't. You carry yourself with this grace, like nothing can shake you. And, I hesitated, feeling the heat rise in my chest. And you're beautiful. Not just on the outside. The kind of beautiful that stays. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Instead, she reached out and let her hand rest gently on my arm. The touch was light, careful, but the warmth of it spread through me instantly. Thank you, she whispered, and there was something fragile in her tone, something that made me want to protect her from every doubt she carried. The rain outside grew heavier, filling the silence. Her hand lingered on my arm, and though it wasn't much, it felt like the most honest connection I'd ever experienced. In that moment, we weren't a friend's mom and her son's friend. We were just two people, quietly revealing the parts of ourselves we usually kept hidden. And I knew, I would never forget this night. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle by the time I set my empty cup aside. The house was hushed, my friend still tucked away upstairs, and for a while it felt as though the world had narrowed to this single living room, this single moment. She rose from the couch slowly, smoothing the fabric of her sweater as though gathering herself, then walked toward the window. I watched as she drew the curtain back just a little, peering outside. The street was quiet, the lamplight catching in the raindrops clinging to the glass. You should probably get going soon, she said softly, though there was no firmness in her tone. If anything, it sounded reluctant, like she wasn't ready to end the evening either. I stood, slipping my shoes back on, but I didn't move toward the door just yet. Instead, I found myself crossing the room to where she stood. She didn't step back when I came beside her. We both looked out the window in silence, though neither of us was really paying attention to the rain. When she turned her head, our faces were suddenly close, too close. I could feel the warmth of her breath, see the faint rise and fall of her chest. Her eyes lingered on mine, then flickered downward for just a fraction of a second, to my lips, before darting back up again. The air between us tightened, charged with everything we hadn't said. I swallowed, my heart hammering. Thank you, for tonight. For listening. My voice was low, almost a whisper. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. You make it easy, she said, and the softness in her tone nearly unraveled me. For a moment, neither of us moved. My hand lifted slightly, almost of its own accord, until my fingertips hovered near her arm. I stopped myself just before touching, the restraint nearly painful. She seemed to notice, her gaze flickered to my hand, then back to my face, her expression torn between caution and something deeper. And then, she reached first. Just a small gesture, her hand rising to adjust my collar where it had folded awkwardly. The tips of her fingers brushed against the side of my neck as she smoothed the fabric, and that single touch sent a shiver racing down my spine. It should have been nothing. It was nothing. But it felt like everything. The silence grew heavy, our bodies leaning unconsciously closer, drawn by something neither of us dared name. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the unspoken battle between wanting and restraint. And when her hand lingered a moment longer than necessary before pulling away, I knew she felt it too. We stood there, suspended in that fragile space between what was right and what we both wanted. My heart ached with the nearness, with the impossibility of the moment. Then she stepped back, just enough to break the spell. Her smile was warm but careful, steadying herself. You should go, she whispered, though her voice carried the same reluctance as before. I nodded, though part of me wished the night could stretch on forever. Because in that charged silence, in that almost touch, everything had already been said without a single word. I moved toward the door slowly, as though each step might delay the inevitable ending of the night. She followed behind, her presence quiet but steady, and I could feel the weight of everything that had passed between us hanging in the silence. At the doorway, I slipped on my jacket. She leaned against the frame, arms folded lightly, her eyes watching me in that soft, searching way I'd come to recognize. It wasn't the look of someone being polite. It was the look of someone memorizing. "Thanks again, for dinner, and for everything," I said, fumbling a little over the words. My voice was lower than usual, because I was afraid it might break if I let too much out. She smiled, gentle and a little tired, but beautiful all the same. "I should be the one thanking you." It was nice, having someone to talk to. I nodded, though her words meant more to me than she could have known. And for a moment, it felt like we were both standing on the edge of something fragile, something we couldn't step into without changing everything. I opened the door halfway, the cool night air spilling into the hallway. But before I could step out, she reached for me. Her hand closed lightly around my wrist, her fingers warm against my skin. The touch stopped me in my tracks. When I turned, she was closer than before, her expression softened by something unguarded. "Wait," she whispered. Then, almost as if she'd made a decision she couldn't take back, she leaned in and wrapped her arms around me. The hug wasn't rushed. Her arms slipped around my shoulders with quiet certainty, pulling me gently toward her. I hesitated for only a second before letting myself sink into the embrace. My arms circled her waist, careful but firm, and I felt the steady rise and fall of her breath against my chest. Her cheek rested lightly over my heart, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of us moved. I could feel her heartbeat against mine, slower, steadier, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. The world outside the door, the rules and boundaries, all seemed far away compared to this simple, undeniable closeness. When she finally drew back, her hands lingered on my arms. She looked at me then, really looked, her eyes carrying a warmth I hadn't seen in anyone's before. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a promise. But it was real. "Take care of yourself," she said softly, and the weight in her voice told me that those words meant more than the simple phrase. I managed a small smile, though my chest ached at the thought of leaving. "You too." She let her hands fall back slowly, almost reluctantly, and I stepped into the cool night. The door closed gently behind me, but the warmth of her embrace stayed with me, clinging to my shirt like her perfume, imprinted deep into me. As I walked down the quiet street, the rain-washed air cool against my face, my heart still pounded with the memory of her touch, her voice, her eyes. Nothing had been said outright, but something had begun, something fragile, unspoken, and unforgettable. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I would never forget the night her arms held me close, and I finally felt seen. If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more slow burn romances, and share it with someone who loves heartfelt storytelling as much as you do.